Thank you so much, Chairman Latta, and thanks to you and Ranking Member Matsui for holding this hearing. I agree with my colleagues who've gone before and saying this has been a really good hearing. There's been a lot of good information, good questions, and I've really appreciated the testimony of all the witnesses sharing their thoughts with us today. I'm sorry that I missed Representative Allen because I really appreciated some of his questions, especially around AI and copyright and content creators and really thinking about the challenges we have when it comes to learning. But what I wanted to follow up on his question, he was asking some questions about bias. And so I wanted to circle back to you, Dr. Turner-Lee, because you talked about the potential for bias and for exacerbating sort of existing inequalities in your written testimony, talking about the digitally invisible and experiences that are underrepresented. And so what I would love to know is if you could talk a little bit more about how we address that bias and what the researchers and experts kind of recommend as ways to achieve unbiased models.
Well, thank you so much, Congressman, for that question. I think today we've been speaking of bias as a static concept, and really the inputs that go into AI models may be static based on our presumptions, our values, our beliefs. I always constantly tell people, computers don't bias, we do, right? So how the model starts is actually the bias that goes into the model development. But over time, the model actually takes on its own characteristics. Once it's deployed in the real world setting, it begins to pick up with our digital footprints these behaviors that then lean towards either explicit bias that has high risk implications or bias that just may be, I like buying black jackets and that's where I want my ad bias to be. My point is, we constantly have to interrogate these models. There's no way out of this. First, positioning seats at the table for people who understand the lived experiences of communities as a start, putting in accountability measures that allow us to have interdisciplinary conversations around this. I'm a sociologist, I'm not a computer scientist. So I understand society, whereas my computer science friends understand the technology itself. So forcing that interdisciplinary perspective. And then giving some leeway to groups that are not typically developing data sets, to be able to go in and hack through, or we're seeing red teaming now as a best practice, so that they can identify where the bias is actually forming, but really tackling the iterative progression of bias, which is something I think, again, as we have conversations, this is not something that we can turn on and turn off, Congresswoman. It's something that evolves because these technologies, different from others, grow with who we are. And that is why they actually represent the outputs that they have.
Well, thank you so much for that. I think it's really helpful in thinking about, how do you do that? How do you interrogate the model, and how do you continue to do that and set up a system where that is something where you're not just confirming existing bias and that you have the opportunities. Seems like a challenge for the computer scientists as well as for the others. I was a history major, so I'm on that side of the world too. But I do think as we're sitting here talking about kind of what we do going forward, the kinds of things that we can help with from Congress, there were two other things actually that you touched on. I'm not sure I'm gonna have time to cover both of them, but I would like for you to talk a little bit more about AI literacy. I think something everybody up here can understand are the challenges that we face going into 2024, and the idea that we need to educate the public about potential uses of AI. I think we've all experienced, it takes a lot to break through, kind of in any context. We've all done it in one way, but how do we educate about how do we do AI literacy? What does that look like, especially when it comes to voter education? What does that look like?
I love that question as well. I mean, I think first and foremost is just basic communication around these new systems and alerting the public that these new systems exist. Giving some accountability to companies to do disclosure so that people know that decisions are being made by automated systems versus systems that tend to be much more analog conceived. And then I think the other thing, and I've suggested this in my research, is giving people tactile reminders around this. I commonly use the reference of the Energy Star rating program when you're going in to do consumer appliances. That's a multi-stakeholder process that gives some assurance of these tools, and it gives accuracy, and it also reports where there are going to be inefficiencies. And that comes from energy folks, appliance people coming together and coming up with some standards. Having those standards will help us with literacy, I think, and I think Congress can play a role in just finding ways to resource those efforts or to bring those standards to bear.
Great. Well, I'm going to run out of time for my last question. So I'll just put this out there, and maybe if y'all want to respond in writing. We've talked a lot about privacy in this hearing, the need for digital privacy. We've obviously addressed it in our committee before, and the chairwoman mentioned today her interest really in moving that forward. So I would just love to know if y'all can maybe submit for the record kind of what you would recommend we be thinking about in the context of privacy protections in the context of AI when we're thinking about how to put together a framework. What are the AI considerations that we should be taking into account in that process? And so thank you all very much for your testimony. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for holding the hearing, and I yield back.